September 1939. A military funeral. A father with graying hair stands at the grave of his son. But this is no ordinary father. He is Prince Oskar of Prussia, a hero of the previous Great War. The son he is burying, also named Oskar, had fallen in Hitler's invasion of Poland. How did a prince of a lost empire bury his son under the Nazi flag? This is the tragic story of a soldier's worst nightmare: to live long enough to see his son fight in the next war. The German Empire at the turn of the 20th century was a nation of explosive energy and profound contradictions. It was the youngest of Europe's great powers, a nation-state born only in 1871 from the crucible of war. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the historic palace of Germany's old enemy, France, the various German kings and princes had proclaimed King Wilhelm I of Prussia as the first German emperor, or Kaiser. This new Reich was the creation of the political genius of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and the unparalleled military might of the Kingdom of Prussia. In less than 40 years, this new Germany had transformed itself. It became the undisputed industrial and scientific engine of the continent. Its factories outproduced Britain's. Its universities and laboratories led the world in physics, chemistry, and medicine. It was a world of breathtaking modernity, the home of Max Planck and Albert Einstein. But this futuristic scientific society was layered over, and in many ways governed by, a deeply conservative, authoritarian, and almost feudal social structure. It was a land of poets and thinkers, but it was ruled by a rigid aristocracy of landowners, the Junkers, and dominated by an institution that was seen as the very soul of the nation, the Prussian army. The army was more than a branch of government. It was, as one observer noted, a state within the state, a model of discipline, hierarchy, and obedience to which the rest of society was expected to aspire. At the very pinnacle of this dynamic, militaristic world stood the House of Hohenzollern, and its complex, ambitious, and deeply insecure ruler, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Oskar's father. Wilhelm, who ascended the throne in 1888, the year Oskar was born, embodied the aspirations and anxieties of his empire. He was fiercely intelligent and possessed a restless energy, but he was also impulsive, arrogant, and prone to bombastic, threatening speeches that frequently terrified the other courts of Europe. Much of his personality can be traced to two key facts of his life. First, he was the grandson of Queen Victoria, making him a first cousin to both King George V of Britain and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. He had a deeply conflicted relationship with his British heritage, a mix of admiration for Britain's global power and a bitter, jealous rivalry. Second, he had been born with a permanently damaged left arm, the result of a traumatic breech birth. It was a disability he spent his entire life trying to conceal and overcompensate for, leading to a lifelong obsession with displays of masculine strength, military prowess, and unshakable authority. He dismissed Bismarck, the man who had built the empire, and embarked on his own aggressive foreign policy, or Weltpolitik, demanding Germany's place in the sun, a global empire to rival Britain's. For Kaiser Wilhelm, his family was a microcosm of the nation, and he was its undisputed commander-in-chief. He and his wife, the Empress Augusta Victoria, known affectionately as Donna, had a surprisingly durable and conventional marriage. Donna was a deeply pious, traditional, and conservative woman who saw her primary role as producing heirs for the dynasty, and she was remarkably successful. They had 7 children, 6 sons, born in quick succession, and a single beloved daughter. The boys were, in order of birth, Wilhelm the Crown Prince, Eitel Friedrich, Adalbert, August Wilhelm, Oskar, and finally, Joachim. The Kaiser's sons were not raised with the gentle liberal sensibilities of their British cousins. They were raised to be model Prussian princes, which meant they were raised to be soldiers, first and foremost. Their childhood was not their own. It was an extended training exercise for their future roles as military leaders. Their education was entrusted to a special institution established in an old castle in Plön, in Schleswig-Holstein. The Prinzenhaus, or Prince's House, was designed to be the antithesis of a pampered palace life. The discipline was famously severe, the daily routine Spartan. The boys were woken early for cold baths and rigorous physical exercise. Their curriculum was heavy on military history, strategy, and languages, but light on the arts and humanities. The goal, as dictated by the Kaiser, was to strip them of any sense of royal entitlement, to instill in them the ironclad Prussian virtues of duty, Pflicht, discipline, and sacrifice, Opferbereitschaft, and to forge them into hardened, unquestioning servants of the state. Prince Oskar Karl Gustav Adolf, born in the summer of 1888 at the Marmor Palais in Potsdam, entered this world as the fifth son. His position in the family hierarchy offered a strange mix of pressures and freedoms. He was not the Crown Prince Wilhelm, who bore the crushing, lifelong burden of preparing to be the next emperor. Nor was he the second son, Eitel Friedrich, who was groomed to be his brother's primary support. Oskar was one of the younger boys, slightly further from the intense glare of the spotlight. By all accounts, he was a more sensitive and introspective child than some of his more boisterous and athletic brothers. He was intelligent and thoughtful, but his physical constitution was less robust, and he often struggled with illness in his youth. Yet whatever his personal inclinations might have been, his path was rigidly prescribed by Hohenzollern tradition. At the age of 10, as was customary, he was formally commissioned as a lieutenant into the most prestigious regiment of the Prussian army, the 1st Foot Guards. Several years later, he would transfer to the 7th Grenadier Regiment based in Potsdam, the unit he would one day lead into battle. His life was sworn to the service of the army and the crown. It was a world built on hierarchy and obedience, a world that had little patience for personal desires or romantic notions. It was a lesson he was about to learn in the most intimate and challenging way imaginable. This rigid world of the parade ground and the palace was designed to mold the Kaiser's sons into pillars of the state, their personal lives secondary to the demands of the dynasty. But as Prince Oskar came of age, transitioning from the harsh discipline of the Prinzenhaus to the life of a young guards officer in Potsdam, the introspective boy began to grow into a man with a will of his own. While he excelled in his military duties, a force far more powerful than tradition was about to take hold of his life, leading him into a quiet personal rebellion that would pit the desires of his heart directly against the iron laws of his house. Having graduated from the iron discipline of the Prinzenhaus at Plön, Prince Oskar's life became centered on Potsdam. Potsdam was not just a city of magnificent royal palaces like Sanssouci. It was the spiritual and ceremonial heart of the Prussian army. It was a city of barracks, parade grounds, and exclusive officers' messes, where the military elite of the German Empire lived in a proud, insular world of their own. As a young officer in the prestigious 7th Grenadier Regiment, Oskar's life was a meticulously scheduled rotation of drills, maneuvers, and formal court functions. He was, by all accounts, a thoroughly competent and dedicated officer. He took his military duties with the utmost seriousness, unlike his older brother, the Crown Prince, whose reputation for womanizing and frivolity often caused the Kaiser great anxiety. Oskar was different. He was reserved, studious, and possessed a quiet dignity that earned him the respect, if not always the warm affection, of his peers. While his brothers might be found at the center of a boisterous party, Oskar was more likely to be found on the sidelines, an observer rather than a participant. This introspective nature, however, concealed a formidable, unyielding willpower. He had been raised to believe that a Hohenzollern prince's life was not his own. It belonged to the state, the dynasty, and God. His personal desires were meant to be subordinate to the immense weight of his duty. But as he entered his mid-20s, Prince Oskar was about to embark on a quiet, personal rebellion. A rebellion fought not on a battlefield with cannons and rifles, but in the gilded corridors of the imperial palaces. A battle for the one thing the rigid laws of his house sought to deny him, the right to marry for love. In the exclusive, highly stratified world of the Wilhelmina court, there were few women considered a suitable match for a son of the Kaiser. A princess was expected to marry a prince of equal standing. The laws of the House of Hohenzollern were ancient and explicit on this matter. A dynastic or ebenbürtig marriage could only be contracted with a member of a reigning or formerly sovereign, royal, or high noble house. To marry below this exalted rank was to risk the stability and prestige of the dynasty itself. The woman who captured Prince Oskar's heart did not meet this exacting standard. Her name was Countess Ina Marie Helene Adele Elise von Bassewitz. She was the daughter of a prominent count from one of the oldest and most respected noble families in Mecklenburg. The Bassewitz family could trace its lineage back for centuries, but they were not and had never been royalty. In the cruel but precise calculus of the German court, this made her a commoner for marital purposes. She served as a lady-in-waiting to the Empress, a position that put her at the very center of court life, and it was likely there, amidst the formal balls and receptions, that she and the quiet fifth son of the Kaiser first met. A romance began to blossom, one that had to be conducted with the utmost discretion. In a court buzzing with gossip and intrigue, where every glance and conversation was noted and analyzed, a secret love affair between a prince and a lady-in-waiting was a dangerous game. They would have relied on clandestine meetings, trusted intermediaries, and the secret language of letters to build their relationship, away from the prying eyes of the court, and most importantly, the Kaiser. Oskar, the reserved and dutiful son, had found in Ina Marie a partner of intellect and grace who saw the man, not just the prince. He fell deeply in love with a resolution that stunned those who knew him only as the quiet one among the Kaiser's sons. By 1913, he had made his decision. He would not give her up. He would formally ask his father, the Emperor of Germany and King of Prussia, for permission to marry a simple countess. The confrontation between father and son must have been a moment of incredible tension. On one side, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the absolute monarch, a man who saw himself as the divinely appointed guardian of Hohenzollern tradition. For him, this was not a matter of his son's happiness. It was a matter of state. A morganatic marriage for a son so close to the line of succession, fifth in line at the time, was a dangerous precedent. It would dilute the royal bloodline, create constitutional complexities, and, perhaps worst of all, in his eyes, it would look weak. It would suggest that the iron will of the Hohenzollerns could be bent by something as frivolous as love. On the other side stood Prince Oskar. He was not a firebrand revolutionary, but his quiet determination was a force to be reckoned with. He would have presented his case with respect, but with an unshakable firmness. He had found the woman he wished to make his wife, and if the price of that union was his place in the line of succession, he was prepared to pay it. This was not a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. The dutiful son was finally defying his imperial father, pitting his own personal happiness against centuries of dynastic law. The Kaiser's initial response was a resounding and furious no. The court establishment, the government ministers, and many members of the royal family lined up behind him. They saw Oskar's infatuation as a youthful folly that had to be stamped out for the good of the monarchy. They pressured him, reasoned with him, and likely threatened him with ostracism. But Oskar would not yield. For months, the imperial family was locked in a cold war. It is said that the Empress, Donna, was more sympathetic to her son's plight, and that she worked behind the scenes to soften the Kaiser's resolve. Oskar's unwavering commitment, his willingness to sacrifice his royal birthright for love may have also, in the end, impressed his father. The Kaiser, for all his bluster, had a romantic streak. Furthermore, the alternative was likely worse: a perpetually unmarried, resentful son, or the even greater scandal that might ensue if the relationship continued in secret. In the spring of 1914, after nearly a year of quiet, stubborn resistance, the impossible happened. The Kaiser relented. He would grant his son permission to marry. However, the Kaiser's consent came with strict and humiliating conditions, designed to publicly underline the inequality of the match. The marriage would be officially declared morganatic. This meant Ina Marie would never hold the title of a Princess of Prussia or the style of Royal Highness. A special title was created for her just before the wedding. She became the Countess of Ruppin. It was a noble title, but pointedly not a royal one, and most painfully, it was decreed that their children would bear this new, lesser title and would have no rights of succession to the Prussian or imperial thrones. Like Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Vienna, Prince Oskar had been forced to legally disinherit his own unborn children in order to marry the woman he loved. Their wedding was set for July 31st, 1914, to be held at the magnificent Bellevue Palace in Berlin. It should have been a moment of unadulterated joy, the triumphant conclusion to a long and difficult personal struggle. But the world outside the palace walls was spiraling into madness. Just over a month earlier, on June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated in Sarajevo. In the weeks that followed, the great powers of Europe had moved with a sleepwalker's certainty towards the abyss. On July 28th, Austria-Hungary had declared war on Serbia. On July 30th, Russia, Serbia's ally, ordered the full mobilization of its vast army. For Germany, this was the final tripwire. On the very day of Prince Oskar's wedding, July 31st, Germany issued ultimatums to both Russia and France. The German army was put on a war footing. The guests who gathered at Bellevue Palace that afternoon would have spoken in hushed, anxious tones, not of the bride's dress, but of the looming catastrophe. The air was thick not with romance, but with the terrifying electricity of impending war. As Prince Oskar and the Countess of Ruppin stood before the altar and exchanged their vows, they were keenly aware that their new life together was beginning at the exact moment the world they knew was coming to an end. Their personal victory had been won, but it was utterly overshadowed by a global tragedy. The following day, August 1st, Germany would declare war on Russia. Prince Oskar's honeymoon would last only a few hours. Within days, he would trade his wedding suit for the field gray uniform of his grenadier regiment. He had won the battle for his heart, only to be immediately summoned to the front lines of a war that would consume his country, his family, and his entire generation. The exchange of vows in the quiet of Bellevue Palace was a profound personal victory, the culmination of a long and defiant battle for love. But the ink was barely dry on the marriage certificate when the roar of the outside world became impossible to ignore. The private joy of the new couple was immediately swallowed by a public catastrophe. For Prince Oskar, there would be no honeymoon, no peaceful start to his new life. The wedding suit was to be exchanged for a field gray uniform. The duty he had temporarily challenged for love now reasserted its absolute claim, sending him away from his new bride and directly into the crucible of the First World War. Prince Oskar's honeymoon was over before it began. On the very day after his wedding, August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, it declared war on France. The intricate, interlocking system of alliances had triggered, and the great powers of Europe, which had not known a major continental war for over 40 years, plunged headlong into the abyss. What followed in Germany was a phenomenon known as the Augusterlebnis, the spirit of 1914. The deep political and social divisions of the nation seemed to melt away overnight, consumed by a tidal wave of patriotic fervor. Millions of men rushed to enlist, convinced they were fighting a righteous defensive war. The common belief, shared from the palaces of Potsdam to the beer halls of Munich, was that the conflict would be a swift, glorious adventure. The soldiers would be, they all promised, home by Christmas. For the House of Hohenzollern, this was their ultimate calling. The Kaiser and his sons were the living symbols of the nation's martial spirit. In a potent act of propaganda, all 6 of the Kaiser's sons went to war. The Crown Prince was given command of an entire army. The others, including Prince Oskar, took up their posts as frontline officers. It was a powerful message to the German people. Your princes will bleed with you. For Oskar, the quiet rebel who had just won his personal battle for love, there was no choice. Duty now called with an absolute deafening roar. Leaving his new bride, the Countess of Ruppin, behind, he immediately joined his regiment and headed for the Western Front. Prince Oskar's command was the Grenadier Regiment, König Wilhelm I, 2nd Westpreußisches, number 7. This was no ordinary unit. Based in Liegnitz, it was one of the old, prestigious regiments of the Prussian army, with a history stretching back to the 18th century. It was a proud, professional fighting force, and Oskar, despite his royal blood, was expected to be a leader, not a figurehead. As his regiment was mobilized and loaded onto troop trains bound for the Belgian border, he was now responsible for the lives of over 3,000 men. His unit was part of the 5th Corps, a key component of the German 5th Army, which was under the overall command of his older brother, Crown Prince Wilhelm. Their role in Germany's grand strategy, the infamous Schlieffen Plan, was to push through neutral Luxembourg and southern Belgium, forming the southern pincer of a massive wheeling movement designed to encircle and destroy the French army in a matter of weeks. In the first days of the war, the plan seemed to be working. The long columns of German soldiers in their field gray uniforms marched through the rolling hills of the Ardennes, a seemingly unstoppable force. But the reality of combat, when it came, was a brutal awakening. The first clashes with French and Belgian troops were not the glorious cavalry charges of military paintings. They were chaotic, terrifying encounters against an enemy armed with modern rapid-firing rifles, machine guns, and quick-firing artillery that filled the air with deadly shrapnel. In late August, the German advance slammed into the main French armies in a series of massive engagements known collectively as the Battle of the Frontiers. On August 22, 1914, near the Belgian town of Virton, Prince Oskar's regiment was ordered to attack a heavily defended French position. This was his first major test as a commander in the field. The fighting was savage and confused, taking place in thick woods and rolling farmland shrouded in the smoke of battle. The German tactics of the day still called for dense infantry formations to advance, almost shoulder to shoulder, in the face of enemy fire. It was a holdover from a previous century, and against modern weaponry, it was suicidal. Prince Oskar, true to the Prussian tradition of leading from the front, was not in a rear command post. He was with his men, directing the assault on foot. As he led his grenadiers in a charge across open ground, the air was ripped apart by the sound of French machine guns and artillery. Men fell all around him. In the chaos of the assault, a bullet found him. It struck him in the chest with tremendous force, knocking him to the ground and piercing his lung. The wound was severe. For a time, it was feared that the Kaiser's fifth son would be among the first prominent casualties of the war. He was evacuated to a field hospital in Luxembourg, where surgeons fought to save his life. The news sent a shock through Germany. The Kaiser himself rushed from his headquarters to be at his son's bedside. The visit was a deeply personal moment for a father terrified of losing his child, but it was also a calculated act of public relations. Photographs of the grim-faced emperor visiting his wounded son were published across the empire. The message was clear. The Hohenzollerns were making the ultimate sacrifice. The hero prince, wounded while leading his men in a victorious charge, for the battle was eventually won at a terrible cost, became a powerful symbol of the nation's noble suffering. For his courage, Prince Oskar was awarded the Iron Cross, second class. He had proven his valor in the most undeniable way possible, but his war and the war of his nation was far from over. Oskar survived. His recovery was slow and painful, but as soon as he was deemed fit enough, his sense of duty propelled him back to the front. He returned to a war that was utterly transformed. The swift, mobile campaign of 1914 had failed. The German army had been stopped at the Battle of the Marne, and both sides had dug in. From the Swiss border to the English Channel, a vast, unbroken line of trenches now scarred the face of Europe. The war of movement was dead. The war of attrition had begun. For the next 3 years, Prince Oskar would experience the unique industrialized hell of trench warfare. This was a new kind of combat, one that defied all previous notions of heroism and glory. It was a daily existence of mud, freezing cold, lice, and rats. It was a life lived under the constant nerve-shredding threat of artillery shells, which could tear a man to pieces without warning. And it was a life punctuated by moments of unimaginable terror. The shrill blast of a whistle in the pre-dawn gloom, signaling the order to go over the top, to climb out of the trench and advance across the barbed wire and cratered wasteland of no man's land, directly into the scything fire of enemy machine guns. As a regimental commander, Oskar bore a heavy burden. He was responsible not just for his own life, but for the thousands of men under his command. Every decision he made to order a raid, to call for an artillery barrage, to defend a particular section of the trench, had fatal consequences. He would have written hundreds of letters of condolence to the families of his fallen soldiers, even as he wrote letters home to his own new wife, trying to describe the indescribable, trying to bridge the vast, unbridgeable gap between the home front and the reality of the trenches. Prince Oskar and his regiment fought in several major campaigns, including the bloody offensives in the Champagne region of France. But his ultimate trial by fire came in 1916, when his unit was sent into the inferno of the Battle of Verdun. Verdun was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a gigantic killing machine, a battle of pure annihilation conceived by the German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, to bleed the French army white. For 10 horrific months, the French and German armies threw millions of men and tens of millions of artillery shells at a tiny, strategically insignificant patch of fortified hills. The landscape was obliterated, transformed into a lunar wasteland of mud and splintered trees, where the very earth was composed of shrapnel and human remains. To be sent to Verdun was to be sent to a place where the odds of survival were slim. It was a world of constant deafening noise, of perpetual shelling that pulverized the trenches faster than they could be rebuilt. It was a place of poison gas attacks, of flamethrowers, of brutal hand-to-hand combat in captured bunkers and shattered forts. For Prince Oskar, the sensitive, introspective boy from Plön, this must have been a vision of the apocalypse. He had to lead his men into this meat grinder, to order them to their deaths in a battle that consumed lives with a terrifying industrial efficiency. The experience of Verdun would have burned away any last vestiges of romanticism about war. It would have left him, like so many of his generation, with scars that were not just physical, but psychological, wounds that would never fully heal. He survived Verdun. He survived the rest of the war, leading his men through the final desperate battles of 1918. He would have witnessed the brief hope of the great German spring offensives and the subsequent collapse as Allied armies, bolstered by the arrival of millions of fresh American troops, began to push the exhausted German forces back. He would have felt the crumbling of discipline and morale as his soldiers, starving and disillusioned, realized the war was lost. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns on the Western Front finally fell silent. The Great War was over. Prince Oskar was a survivor. He was a decorated and respected combat veteran who had done his duty as he saw it. But the world he had fought to defend, the German Empire of his father, had already ceased to exist. 2 days earlier, the Kaiser had abdicated and fled to Holland. A republic had been declared in Berlin. Oskar was now a prince without a monarchy, a commander without an army, a soldier of a defeated and broken nation. His war was over, but a new and uncertain struggle for survival, for himself and for his family, was just beginning. The sudden deafening silence of the armistice on November 11th marked the end of 4 years of industrial slaughter. Prince Oskar had survived the trenches, but the soldier, returning from the front, found himself in a homeland he no longer recognized. The empire he had bled for had been swept away by revolution, and his father was in exile. This profound sense of betrayal and disorientation, shared by millions of his fellow veterans, would shape the next chapter of his life. The battle for Germany's survival on the front was over, but a new, bitter struggle for its soul was just beginning, and the prince, now a common citizen, would find himself a key figure in the fight for the past against the future. On November 11th, 1918, the guns of the Great War fell silent. For Prince Oskar of Prussia, a decorated combat veteran, the end of the fighting brought not peace but a profound and disorienting chaos. He had survived the trenches, but he returned home to a nation that was unrecognizable. The German Empire, the world he had fought and bled for, had ceased to exist. His father, the Kaiser, was a reviled figure in exile in the Netherlands. The 500-year reign of the House of Hohenzollern had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper of revolution and abdication. The shock was seismic. Overnight, the 6 sons of the Kaiser went from being the most privileged princes in Europe to private citizens in a fledgling hostile republic. Their royal titles were legally abolished. Their vast properties were seized by the new state, and their very identity was thrown into question. For men who had been raised since birth with a singular purpose, to serve the monarchy, its sudden disappearance was a form of psychological amputation. In the tumultuous early years of the Weimar Republic, the Hohenzollern brothers scattered and struggled to find their footing. The youngest, Prince Joachim, unable to cope with the loss of his status and a bitter divorce, took his own life in 1920. For Oskar, the adjustment was equally difficult, but he faced it with his characteristic stoicism. He and his wife Ina Marie, now a common citizen with a meaningless courtesy title, had to build a new life from the wreckage of the old. There are reports that for a time he even worked in a bookshop in Berlin, a striking image of how far the mighty had fallen. But he would not remain a quiet bookseller for long. The war had forged him into a soldier, and it was among his fellow soldiers that he would find his new purpose. The Weimar Republic was born from defeat, and millions of Germans, particularly the veterans who had survived the front, never accepted its legitimacy. They felt betrayed by the politicians who had signed the armistice and the humiliating Treaty of Versailles. This bitterness fueled the rise of countless right-wing, nationalist, and paramilitary organizations. The largest and most influential of these was the Stahlhelm, Bund der Frontsoldaten, the Steel Helmet League of Front Soldiers. Founded in 1918, the Stahlhelm grew into a massive movement with over 500,000 members at its peak. On the surface, it was a veterans association providing support and camaraderie for men who felt lost and alienated in the new Germany. But at its core, it was a powerful anti-democratic political army. The Stahlhelm was fiercely monarchist. Dreaming of the day the Hohenzollerns would be restored to the throne, it despised the Republic, which it saw as weak and decadent, and it was dedicated to reversing the shame of the Versailles Treaty. Prince Oskar became one of the Stahlhelm's most prominent and revered figures. For the League's rank-and-file members, former soldiers, conservative citizens, and young men yearning for the perceived order of the old empire, Oskar was a living link to that glorious past. He was not just a veteran, he was a son of the last Kaiser, a decorated hero who had been wounded in battle. His presence at their massive rallies, where he would review tens of thousands of marching men, gave the movement a powerful aura of legitimacy and tradition. For Oskar, the Stahlhelm was likely the closest he could come to reclaiming his lost world. It was a community of soldiers, a brotherhood forged in the trenches, united by a shared sense of loss and a burning desire to restore Germany's national honor. Oskar was not alone in his political activities. The entire Hohenzollern family, from the exiled Kaiser in his Dutch manor to the princes still in Germany, was engaged in a constant, often clumsy, campaign to undermine the Republic and engineer a restoration of the monarchy. The former Crown Prince Wilhelm, after a period of exile, was allowed to return to Germany in 1923. He settled into a life of country leisure, but remained a political schemer, constantly meeting with right-wing politicians and industrialists, hoping to find a path back to power. The family placed their greatest hopes in the figure of Paul von Hindenburg, the legendary field marshal from the Great War, who was elected president of the Republic in 1925. Hindenburg was an old-school Prussian monarchist at heart, and the Hohenzollerns believed he would eventually be their savior, that he would use his presidential power to dissolve the Republic and call back the Kaiser. But as the chaotic decade of the 1920s gave way to the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression, a new and far more ruthless political force was rising from the streets, one that would ultimately outmaneuver them all. The Nazi Party's rise from a fringe Munich beer hall gang to the most powerful political movement in Germany was breathtakingly rapid. Adolf Hitler was a master propagandist, and he understood the deep resentments and desires of the German right. He also understood the symbolic power of the old imperial elite. From the beginning, he actively courted the support of prominent aristocrats, industrialists, and, most importantly, the sons of the Kaiser. An endorsement from a Hohenzollern prince was a signal to millions of conservative Germans that the Nazi Party was not just a rabble of violent thugs, but a legitimate patriotic movement with respectable backing. The Kaiser's sons reacted to Hitler's rise in tragically different ways, exposing the deep divisions within the family. The fourth son, Prince August Wilhelm, known as Aui, became an early and ardent Nazi. He saw in Hitler a kindred spirit, a man who could smash the Republic and restore Germany's greatness. He joined the party, took on a high rank in the SA, and became one of its most valuable propaganda tools, the Nazi Prince, who appeared at rallies in his brown shirt uniform to the delight of the crowds. The Crown Prince Wilhelm was more of an opportunist. He saw Hitler not as an idol, but as a useful instrument. In the crucial presidential election of 1932, he publicly endorsed Hitler against the incumbent Hindenburg, a move that shocked and dismayed his father. The Crown Prince foolishly believed that if he helped Hitler into power, the grateful new leader would restore the monarchy with him as Kaiser. It was a fatal miscalculation, born of vanity and political naivety. Prince Oskar's position was more nuanced and perhaps more typical of the traditional German conservative elite. He never joined the Nazi Party and likely held a personal distaste for the vulgar anti-Christian paganism and the street-brawling thuggery of the SA. His loyalties were to the old Prussia of the Kaiser, a world of tradition, church, and aristocratic order, not to Hitler's revolutionary, pseudo-socialist movement. However, his deep involvement with the Nationalist Stahlhelm meant he was marching in the same direction as the Nazis, even if he wasn't in their ranks. In 1933, the Stahlhelm was absorbed into the Nazi SA, a process of political consolidation known as Gleichschaltung. Oskar and his fellow traditional conservatives were either swept aside or forced to accommodate the new reality. They shared the Nazis' hatred of communism and the Weimar Republic, and they shared the dream of a renewed, powerful, militarized Germany. Like so many others, Oskar fell victim to the fatal illusion that the Nazis were a temporary, if unpleasant, necessity, a tool to be used to destroy the left, after which the old elites could step in and restore a monarchy. In March 1933, this tragic collaboration was put on full display at the Day of Potsdam. It was a carefully staged propaganda masterpiece, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, to mark the opening of the new Reichstag after the Nazis had seized power. The ceremony saw Adolf Hitler, the new chancellor, bowing respectfully before the aged President Hindenburg, presenting himself not as a radical revolutionary, but as the humble inheritor of the Prussian tradition of Frederick the Great. The sons of the Kaiser, including Prince Oskar, were there as honored guests, their presence lending the new regime the priceless stamp of historical legitimacy. They thought they were witnessing the rebirth of old Prussia. In reality, they were attending its funeral. As Hitler consolidated his power, the Hohenzollerns' dream of a restoration faded into fantasy. The Führer had no intention of sharing power with a Kaiser, but the family, like the rest of Germany, was now trapped. They were symbols of a past that Hitler alternately used and suppressed. And they had a new generation to raise, children who grew up not in the world of the German Empire, but in the world of the Third Reich. Prince Oskar's children were raised on a steady diet of their family's glorious past and a deep resentment for the defeat of 1918. They would have listened to their father and his veteran comrades rail against the injustices of Versailles and the weakness of the Republic. They grew up in a culture that glorified military service and yearned for national rebirth. So when Adolf Hitler tore up the Treaty of Versailles and reintroduced military conscription in 1935, it was almost inevitable that the young sons of Prince Oskar would answer the call. For them, joining the new powerful Wehrmacht was not just a patriotic act, it was a sacred family duty. It was a chance to reclaim the honor their grandfathers had possessed, to finally avenge the humiliation of 1918, and to prove that the Hohenzollern spirit of military service was as strong as ever. As Germany rearmed and the world once again drifted towards war, the sons of the veteran of the First Great War eagerly prepared to fight in the Second, unaware that this ultimate act of duty would lead directly to the ultimate family tragedy. And so, the stage was set for a tragedy forged across generations. The father's resentments, the family's political ambitions, and a nation's burning desire to erase the shame of its past had created a new, powerful war machine. For the young princes of the next generation, joining this new army was the ultimate expression of the duty that had been drilled into them since birth. As the tense summer of 1939 drew to a close, this abstract sense of duty was about to collide with the horrific reality of modern warfare, and for the family of Prince Oskar, the theoretical sacrifice would become a devastating personal loss on the battlefields of Poland. By the late summer of 1939, the flimsy pretense of peace in Europe was shattered. Having already annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, Adolf Hitler turned his sights on Poland. The German war machine, the new Wehrmacht, meticulously rebuilt in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, was a force unlike any the world had ever seen. It was an army of tanks, dive bombers, and motorized infantry, designed for a new kind of warfare, the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. This was the army that the sons of the old German aristocracy, including Prince Oskar's firstborn, had eagerly joined. They were steeped in the traditions of the past, but they were now cogs in a thoroughly modern and terrifyingly efficient machine of conquest. For them, this was the moment of destiny, the chance to prove their worth and to restore the martial glory of their ancestors. On September 1st, 1939, under the false pretext of responding to a staged Polish attack, the German armies stormed across the border. The Second World War had begun. Lieutenant Prince Oskar Wilhelm Karl Hans Kuno von Preußen, just 23 years old, was an officer in the 3rd Company of Infantry Regiment 51. His unit was part of the initial wave of the invasion, tasked with breaking through Polish defenses in the north. The fighting was intense from the very first day. The Polish army, though outmatched in technology, fought with desperate courage for its homeland. On September 5th, only the 5th day of the war, Oskar Jr.'s regiment was engaged in a fierce battle to secure a crossing over the Vistula River near the town of Sanssouci. The Polish resistance was unexpectedly strong. The German infantry had to advance across open fields under heavy machine gun and mortar fire. It was a scene of terrifying chaos, a brutal echo of the battles his father had fought a generation earlier. In the heat of the assault, as he led his men forward, Lieutenant Prince Oskar was struck down. The wound was grievous. He was evacuated to a field hospital, but the medical science of 1939 was little better at saving a man from such devastating injuries than it had been in 1914. He died of his wounds the following day. The news of his death traveled from the bloody fields of Poland back to the quiet, anxious home front in Germany. For Prince Oskar and Ina Marie, the arrival of that official telegram was the moment their world ended. The father, the veteran of Verdun, a man who had survived the First War, had now lost his son and namesake in the opening act of the second. The great abstract machinery of history and politics had reached into his home and torn out its heart. The pride he must have felt seeing his son in uniform was now transformed into the deepest and most desolate grief a parent can know. The torch of duty, passed from one generation to the next, had led his son not to glory, but to an early grave. The funeral of Lieutenant Prince Oskar, held on September 11, 1939, became an extraordinary and unexpected political event. The Nazi regime had intended for it to be a solemn but controlled propaganda piece. The heroic death of a young officer, a scion of the old royal house who had given his life for the new Germany. But something else happened. An enormous, spontaneous crowd of thousands of ordinary citizens from Potsdam and Berlin descended upon the park of Sanssouci to pay their respects. They lined the funeral route, standing in a dense, silent throng. This was not an organized Nazi rally. It was something different, something older. Among the mourners were many aging men, dressed in their threadbare pre-1918 imperial uniforms, their chests adorned with the iron crosses their Kaiser had given them. They had come not to mourn a soldier of the Third Reich, but to mourn a prince of the lost German Empire. The event turned into a powerful, albeit silent, demonstration of lingering monarchist sentiment. It was a collective expression of grief, not just for the young prince, but for the world that his family represented. The sight of the old Kaiser's son, standing stoically by the grave of the old Kaiser's grandson, stirred a deep, nostalgic loyalty that the Nazi regime had tried so hard to extinguish. Adolf Hitler was reportedly enraged. He had been completely blindsided by this public outpouring of affection for the former imperial house. He saw with paranoid clarity that the old aristocracy and the ghost of the monarchy still held a powerful sway over the hearts of many Germans. They were a potential rival center of loyalty. He was determined that it would not happen again. In the spring of 1940, Hitler issued a secret decree known as the Prinzenerlass, or the Prince's Decree. It ordered that all princes from Germany's former ruling houses who were serving in the Wehrmacht were to be dismissed from combat service. A few were allowed to remain in high command posts, but the vast majority were effectively barred from the front lines. The Führer was unwilling to risk the creation of more royal martyrs who could serve as rallying points for the conservative opposition. The tragic, unintended consequence of young Oskar's death was that it likely saved the lives of many of his cousins and relatives, who were now forbidden from following him into an early grave. Prince Oskar and his family survived the rest of the war, living through the firebombing of German cities and the final apocalyptic collapse of the Third Reich in 1945. They witnessed their nation's total defeat and its subsequent division by the Allied powers. Their remaining ancestral estates in the East were seized by the new communist governments of Poland and East Germany, lost forever. They were now exiles in their own country. In the quiet, somber years of post-war West Germany, Prince Oskar dedicated himself to a different, more profound kind of duty. He had long been the Herrenmeister, or Grand Master, of the Johanniterorden, the Protestant Order of St. John, a chivalric and charitable organization with a history stretching back to the Crusades. In the aftermath of the Nazi catastrophe, he poured his remaining energy into rebuilding the order. He worked tirelessly to reestablish its hospitals, its ambulance services, and its nursing homes, transforming it into one of West Germany's largest and most respected charitable organizations. It was a quiet, humble, and noble end to a life that had begun in the palaces of emperors. The man who had been raised to command soldiers now found his final purpose in commanding an army of doctors, nurses, and volunteers. The prince, who had seen so much death, dedicated the rest of his life to preserving life. Prince Oskar of Prussia died in a Munich hospital in January 1958 at the age of 69 from stomach cancer, a disease that had also claimed his mother and several of his brothers. He was buried in the Hohenzollern family cemetery at the ancient castle that was the cradle of his dynasty. He had lived long enough to witness the entirety of his nation's most turbulent and tragic chapter: the fall of the German Empire, the chaos of the Weimar Republic, the horror of the Third Reich, and the slow, painful rebirth of a democratic West Germany. His life is a story of profound moral complexity, a case study in the fatal compromises made by a conservative elite who thought they could control the demonic forces of Nazism. He was not a Nazi zealot, nor was he a hero of the resistance. He was a traditionalist, a man of duty who, like so many of his class, made a series of choices that helped to enable a criminal regime, a decision that would ultimately cost him his own son. More than anything, his story is a poignant illustration of the cyclical nature of war and the inheritance of generational trauma. The father, scarred and hardened by the trenches of the First World War, passes on a code of military duty to his son, who then perishes in the opening days of the Second. It is a heartbreaking reminder that the abstract forces of history, nationalism, and ideology are paid for with the concrete, irreplaceable lives of our children. In the end, all the grand titles, the fallen empires, and the sweep of history fall away. We are left with a single, universal, and devastating image: a father's grief. Prince Oskar of Prussia was born with every privilege a human being could imagine, but all the palaces and pedigrees in the world could not shield him from the most profound pain a person can endure. His tragedy is a timeless lesson. It reminds us that the true cost of war is never measured in territory gained or enemies vanquished. It is measured in individual lives cut short and in the unending silent sorrow of those who are left behind to bury their dead. The soldier prince who fought for his Kaiser and survived was ultimately defeated not on the battlefield, but by a grief that knows no rank or title, the grief of a father who had to bury his son